Colette was one of the few writers who took for granted that women's lives were important. Erica Young. In 1893, an unknown provincial named Sydney Gabrielle Colette moved from Burgundy to bustling Paris, beginning a new life with Henri Gauthier Villars. Willie. Her groundbreaking first novel, Claudine in School, was published under her husband's name in 1900, and she received no recognition for her literary genius. Largely biographical, the book broke creative barriers in the world of young adult literature. However, their marriage deteriorated, causing a scandalous divorce in Catholic-dominated France. Colette then lived by herself, was employed as a music hall mime, and became romantically involved with another woman. Her writing mirrored her unconventional lifestyle, and she provided an unprecedented female perspective on lesbianism, further shattering barriers regarding same-sex love. In a time where women were defined exclusively by men, Colette challenged gender barriers and laid the foundation for modern feminism. During the French Revolution in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was passed, stating, "Men are born free and equal," thus setting precedent for the political neglect of women's rights. Further, the Napoleonic Code of 1804 created barriers to gender equality by upholding social divides between men and women. As a result, women had marginal political status and were expected to marry, have children, and take care of the household. This was the France Sydney Gabrielle Colette was born into on January 28, 1873. In a small Burgundy town, Gabrielle enjoyed an idyllic childhood. It wasn't until her late teens, when she met Willie, a Parisian publisher, that she desired a lifestyle change. On May 15, 1893, they were married. The two moved to Paris, and girlish Gabrielle became womanly Colette. She was dazzled by the Belle Epoque city of exuberant wealth and culture. However, Colette soon discovered Willie cheating on her. Despite that, she remained devoted to Willie. After visiting Burgundy in 1898, Willie urged Colette to write, saying, "You ought to put down what you remember of your boarding school days." So Colette wrote. However, Willie was disappointed by her writing and forgot about the story. Until, 2 years later, Willie came across Colette's writing. Recognizing its potential, he published Claudine in School under his name. In the first month, over 40,000 copies were sold, and Willie rose to unforeseen literary fame. While Willie enjoyed the decadence of notoriety, Colette was locked in the attic and forced to write. She reflected that, "A prison is one of the best workshops." In 1901, Claudine in Paris was published, reflecting on the main character's transition into womanhood. In 1902, Claudine in Marriage was published, mirroring the sexual inequality of married women. Finally, in 1903, the last book, Claudine and Annie, was published, telling the story of two married women in love with each other. Throughout the Claudine books, Colette broke the confines of language rules, social taboos, and stereotypes of female sexuality. In their entirety, the Claudine series represents Colette's deconstruction of social barriers. As Colette questioned her marriage, she moved into her own apartment in January of 1906. At this time, Colette frequented a sapphic literary club where high society women, who wore men's clothes and loved other women, gathered. Such women included the self-exiled British writers Radcliffe Hall and Renee Vivian, as well as the American poet Natalie Barney, whom Colette had an affair with. The Paris prefect of police, Inspector Lepine, knew of their heinous gatherings and censored the women. At this time, Colette studied mime with George Weah, a renowned actor, and began to perform with him. Her first performance in February 1906 was in the show Desire, Love, and Chimera. Critics praised her, saying, "She emitted an indefinable and troubling odor of sensuality." At this time, Colette was romantically involved with the Marquis de Belleboeuf. Missy. In 1907, Colette performed the play Dream of Egypt with Missy at Moulin Rouge, a renowned cabaret in Montmartre, Paris. During the performance, the two women shared a passionate onstage kiss, breaking barriers of queer representation and Parisian performance. The shocked audience descended into lawlessness, causing Prefect Lepine to forbid a second performance. One newspaper critic accused Colette of immorality. Even so, her performances and relationship with Missy continued. As Colette's divorce to Willie was made official in 1910, she published her novel, The Vagabond. Reflective of her liberation from marriage, her novel challenged suffocating societal expectations. Throughout her career, Colette declared herself an anti-feminist. In an interview shortly after the publication of The Vagabond, she was asked about female suffragists, to which she responded, "Do you know what they deserve, the suffragettes? The whip and the harem." As social, political, and economic barriers restricted her autonomy, Colette exercised conscious power over her life. Even though she was a self-declared anti-feminist, Colette's embodiment of feminine liberty made her a symbol for later feminist movements. When World War I broke out in 1914, Colette watched as Paris became a city of women. In 1920, she was one of the first women awarded the Knight of the Legion of Honor, the highest civil merit in France. In that same year, she published Sherry, which became her most acclaimed book. In 1932, Colette published The Pure and the Impure. Colette used this novel to leverage the female gaze and provide a literary legitimization of the lesbian. During World War II, Colette grew desperate for money and became a journalist for several Nazi-controlled newspapers. However, in 1941, after her third husband, Maurice Goudke, was put in a concentration camp, she helped him escape, thus breaking barriers of conformity in occupied Paris. Near the war's end in 1944, French women were finally given the right to vote. Even so, Colette never exercised her right to suffrage. On May 2nd, 1945, Colette was elected onto the Goncourt Literary Academy, where, in 1949, she became the president of the jury and a Renaissance Prize judge. In 1948, Colette met with the feminist writer Simone de Beauvoir, who reflected that Colette was a fellow critic of the patriarchy. 1 year later, de Beauvoir published The Second Sex, exploring progressive ideas related to women's equality. Within the book, Colette was the most cited woman. In her final years, Colette spent most of her time writing in bed. Colette died on August 3, 1954, at age 81. Mourned all throughout Paris, the Minister of National Education, Jean Berthin, declared her one of the great writers of our epoch. Years later, in the 1970s, The Second Sex was heralded as a foundational piece of feminist literature, inspiring French women to organize for their reproductive rights. Colette's influence on de Beauvoir shows her legacy of sexual boundary pushing and advocacy for women's liberation. In 1974, the American feminist writer Erica Jong published the groundbreaking article Retrieving Colette in Ms. Magazine and claimed Colette as a feminist icon. The article declared, "Colette has always seemed to me the most authentic feminist heroine of all women writers. She is an important innovator because she dared to write out of a female consciousness." During this time, many of Colette's books were being translated into English and embraced by American feminists for their denunciation of oppressive marriage.
Colette was especially appealing to American feminists because she had been liberated in these personal and professional ways. She provided a really interesting example of what being a woman writer could be.
Although during her lifetime, Colette asserted herself as anti-feminist, her unique lifestyle as a divorced woman challenged domestic barriers. Colette was selfless when she freed her husband from the German death camps, consequently breaking fascist barriers. Through her writing, she explored the lives of complex women and broke creative barriers which attempted to confine her style, social barriers which attempted to dictate her subject matter, religious barriers which policed her way of life, and political barriers which strove to disempower her. Thus, Colette continues to symbolize liberation for women and stand as an advocate for gender equality. If her passion is once awoken, then woman is known no longer as a wife or a mother, but rather as a plotter and conspirator without limits. Sydney Gabrielle Colette.